Jamila, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. We can start?
Yeah, go ahead whenever you want.
Okay. So, a very warm welcome to all of you for the next edition of CAFFE seminars, where the topic today is a little bit different from finance. It's about politics and biased information. And the first speaker will be Julia Cage. I encourage all of you to turn on your cameras so that we can see you. And Julia, the screen is yours. You have 25 minutes.
So perfect. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot for attending the seminar. So I'm going to present this joint work together with Maurice Engel, who was a PhD student at Sciences Po Paris, Nicolas Hervé from the Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, and Camille Urvois, who is an assistant professor at the University of Mannheim. The title of the talk is Hosting Media Bias, and the question we want to tackle in this talk is the one of media slant. If you look at news in whatever country you live, you will easily realize that not all media outlets cover news and politics in the same way. But we know at the same time that voters, they need to be exposed to a variety of views for democracy to function. Then you can say, okay, we need enough pluralisms to guarantee that voters are exposed to enough point of views. And for that, one thing that you can do is to promote pluralism across outlets, in particular by regulating ownership diffusion. But very often it might not be enough. Even today, when you have like a variety of news sources, if you look at the way people consume news, they still tend only to focus on a few number of media outlets. And this is why we also need pluralism within outlets, and in particular within TV channel, within radio station. And you have a number of countries. I could talk about the UK as of today with Ofcom. I would talk about France. Historically, the US with the fairness doctrine, they tend to regulate political speeches within each TV channels or radio stations. Very often when you look at this literature on media bias, and there is a very large literature on media bias that I won't have time to review, given that I would give a short presentation. Very often when we consider media bias, we tend to focus on owners, and there is a debate, whether like bias is driven by demand or whether this is driven by supply. But our view is that one thing that we doesn't really know. So we know that when you have a change in ownership, this was documented, for example, by huge literature using the case of Rupert Murdoch in the US. You have a change in ownership, you can have a change in media content. But what we do not really know is the way it happens precisely. And in particular, the way owners can influence media content within the media organization. And what is striking is that if you look at who is in charge of the daily media content production, these are not the owners. This tends to be the journalists themselves. And so what we want to do in the paper is kind of to open the black box of news production and to see at the end of the day, through which mechanisms owners can influence the news. Can they do that by picking some journalists that are going to comply with the editorial line? Do we see compliance? Do we see also sorting? And we are going to try to measure these different dimensions. To do so, what did we do? We built a novel data set that include all TV and radio shows broadcasted in France between 2002 and 2020. We have more than 18 outlets covered. Basically, these are all the outlets operating for free on the French broadcasting market. And for each of these outlets, we have the universe of the shows with hosts and guests. So we'll have 2.3 million guest appearances, and we have more than 20K distinct hosts. We are going to look at each of the shows, which will allow us first to build a measure of ideological representation in the media. And for that, we are going to focus on the host, and look at the kind of guest they invite. But I am going to give you more detail in a few minutes. And then the second thing that we are going to do to disentangle the role played by demand the role played by ownership and the role played by journalists in biasing the news, is that we are going to rely on the fact that a large number of hosts in our dataset are moving from one channel to the other. So basically, we are going to use this move from one channel to the other to estimate a model where we will be able to identify the role played by a channel fixed effect versus the role played by journalist fixed effect in biasing the news. So this is what we will do in the first. This is what we do in the first part of the paper that I'm going to present you first. I will show you that at the end of the day there is a lot of compliance, and then we turn to a case study. And we rely to a major change in the editorial line, which is a takeover by Vincent Bolloré. So Vincent Bolloré, very often, even in France, is called the French Rupert Murdoch. He took over 3 TV channels in 2015, and we are going to look at what happened in terms of coverage of politics following the takeover. And one of the nice things that we can do is that basically we are going to look at whether hosts they stay or whether they leave, and also look at the characteristics of the stayers versus the leavers following the takeover. So let me move quickly to the data set. So this is a new data set we built from data from the National Audiovisual Institute, where one of my co-authors work. And what the characteristic of this data set is basically that for all the main TV and public private radio stations between 2002 and 2020, we have the list of each of the show broadcast. We have the length of the show, and we will have information on all the hosts working for the show and the guests invited in the show. So we will first collect data on the journalists working for the show, and we are going to use what I was telling you before, kind of the movers. So the journalists moving from one channel to the other. And what you will see, and this will be key for identification, this is just a co-occurrence matrix of the host observed on multiple outlets. One of the things that you see here is that there is a lot of moves. So we are going to rely on these moves between outlets to identify both the channel fixed effect and the journalist fixed effect. And the second thing that we did is that we collect data on the guests invited by the show. And I want to highlight that these guests can be in the studio, but if you have, let's say, the French president giving a press conference, and the press conference is just broadcast by one TV channel, it will also be considered as a guest in our data. At the end of the day, we have 2.3 million appearances of guests with 260,000 distinct guests. What we do, and what took us a lot of time in terms of dataset construction, is that we want to classify the guests depending on their political leaning, and their political leaning, if any, because of course a lot of guests in our shows they are just going to be academics, people doing sport, or authors of novels, but some of them are going to be involved into politics, and we are going to identify them. First, we are going to identify the politicians, and for that, we just use a list of candidates running for election. And in general, these politicians are the focus of both the literature and the regulatory agencies. Very often, when they try to regulate media pluralism, they focus on the subset of politicians. We go one step further, because one of the things that we see in the moving landscape in many Western democracies is that to escape regulation, TV and radio channels, they invite less and less politicians, and they invite more and more what we call politically engaged non-politicians, pin-ups. These are guests who are politically vocal, but who are not professional politicians in the sense that are not elected, not candidate, and not in government. And then we are going to group these guests in political families from the radical left to the radical right. Just one precision on how we are able to classify these pin-ups. We use 3 different data sources. First, we use the party summer meeting participants. So basically, each year, all the parties organize big gatherings. And if you decide to participate in these events, it means that you are close, at least close, to a political party. Then we use we establish the list of politically involved think tanks in France, and we look at all the contributors. And then we look at whether or not people endorse candidates in the first round of the presidential election. Of course, I want to insist on the fact that the way we're going to classify the guests over like 20 years is really time varying. Because of course, you can be involved into politics at some point and then leave politics, or the reverse. You can also shift political affiliation. So we are going to use these punctual events, combine them in a probabilistic model, which is going to give us this time varying measure of slant. What do we obtain from that? The first thing that we obtain for that is that we can study the time devoted to politics, and within the time devoted to politics, the time devoted to each political party by channel, which is what we do in our analysis. And what you see here, we look at the timeshare and we plot the timeshare devoted, for example, like if you look at the bottom to the radical right on the different channels between the one that devote the smallest timeshare and the largest timeshare. And you see that there is a lot of difference depending on the media considered. And then the question is, what is driving this difference? And in particular, is that due to selection? So to the fact that different hosts are going to select into different channels, or is that due to like adaptation or like compliance, or do we see like some sorting? So how do we deal with that? We proceed as follow. We are going to use, so I already told you, we are going to use people who move from one channel to the other. And I just want to give you like the intuition behind our empirical strategy. Think about a host who is going to move from a channel that dedicates 40% of its time to the left to a channel that is going to dedicate 50% of its time to the left. The question would be whether or not the host adapts its coverage and dedicates more time to the left. And so to see whether it is the case, we're going just to plot the change in the speaking timeshare for this host against the origin destination channel gap in timeshare. Okay, so basically if the coverage remains the same irrespective of the channel, but the slope should just be 0. And if the mover fully complies with the outlet's guideline, then we should have a slope of 1. What you see here with these very simple descriptive statistics is that basically hosts close 1/3 of the gap in differences in representation when moving across channels. So here is, if we look at the share of political guests among all guests, which would be a way for us to look at the extensive margin, whether or not you decide to devote more time to politics. And what you see, if you look within political groups, on the left-hand side in red, you have the share of left-wing guests among the political guests. On the right-hand side in blue, you have the share of right-wing guests among political guests. And what you see in this case is that the host closed around 2/3 of the gap in differences across channel when moving. So this is of interest, and I'm going to come back to this result. It shows that the hosts are more responsive on the intensive margin than on the extensive margin. Okay. Obviously, when I show you that, you can tell me, okay, but at the end of the day, it might not reflect compliance. It might just reflect sorting. So you might explain a host inviting more and more right-wing guests to be hired by a right-wing TV or radio channel. And so to see whether it is the case, sorry about that, we estimate an event study where the treatment is a coverage gap across channels. And when you see what you see here is basically there is no differences before the move. So basically, there is no pre-trend. We see that hosts are not becoming more in line with the destination channel before the move. And then a change in the speaking time share devoted to the guest following the move. Okay, so this is descriptive. Now, how do we estimate more precisely the role played by a channel fixed effect versus journalists in slanting the news? To do that, basically what we did is that we use strategies that are done by people working with time-varying AKM model. Okay, so you have this very simple model. On the left-hand side, you have the speaking time share of a given political group in the shows hosted by host I on outlet C at time T. Okay, and T is a week time slot level fixed effect. Okay, and then we look at how this is explained by alpha I, which is the host component, gamma C ST, and this is very important, the T here, because we allow this channel component to be time varying. So basically, we allow editorial line change during our time period. And then we have this time component that is going to take into account the fact that you have like a change in news pressure or change also in potential viewership characteristics, depending on the what you are looking at. Okay. And so what we are going to do is that from that, we can estimate the timeshare dedicated to a given group on a given channel in a given period as a function of the channel season effects, on the channel season level expectation of the host characteristics, and on the channel level season expectation of the time components. Okay, and from that we perform a very simple variance decomposition exercise, which is going to tell us the share of the variance that come from adaptation to channel level decisions, or host composition, or just some sorting if you look at the covariance between the host and the channel effects. Okay. When we do that, what do we find? We first find, and this is something that is very striking, whether we look at the share of political guests invited, whether we look at the share of guests from the left invited or the share of guests from the right invited, what we find here is that the channel effect always dominate the host effect. Okay, so basically the differences across channels are not mainly driven by the selection of host, they're rather driven by host adapting to the editorial line of the channel they work for. Okay, so this is the first set of results. And the second thing that we find is that there are some positive sorting. Basically, that channels that emphasize political guests have a set of hosts more inclined to cover political guests. Okay. So this is when we look at political guests versus all left or all right, we can look like political party by political party. So we plot the results political party by political party from the radical left to the radical right. Again, we saw that the channel effects always dominate the host effect, and this is true for any political group that we consider here. Okay. From that, we want to look at a case study and basically look at what happened when you have a major change in ownership. In particular, I just documented the fact that you have a lot of compliance, but then you want to see how journalists, they react to the change in ownership. And for that, we are going to use the fact that in France in 2015, so Vincent Bolloré, this French Rupert Murdoch, took over 3 TV channels, Canal+, D8, and iTélé. And this is pretty interesting because iTélé is a 24-hour news channel. This was a very important event for the French media landscape. Following this takeover in 2016, at CNews, they were the longest strike in the history of private media in France. Okay, so how do we first look at the change in editorial line following Bolloré takeover? So the first thing that we do is that we just estimate simple difference in difference model. So where we look at the time share of a political group in show on channel C at time T, okay? And we look at that at the effect of like channel fixed effect. We have a time fixed effect, and then we are going to look at an indicator variable for the acquired channel, Canal, C8 and CNews, and interact it with indicator variables for the post takeover period. Okay. What do we find when we do that and we look at these differences in different estimates is that basically, in particular, you can look at the last column of the table, column 7. What you find is that following the takeover by Bolloré, you have an increase by 2 to 5 percentage point in the radical right timeshare. Okay. Basically, if you compare to the baseline, this means that you have an increase by around 50% in the timeshare dedicated to the radical right following the takeover. Okay. And just, I'm showing you the result of the event study specification for you to be reassured. What you see when you do this event study specification is that there is no pre-trend before the takeover. Okay, before it was flat. If you compared like Bolloré channel with other channel, and then you have the jump at the time of the takeover. Okay. This is true both when you consider only the politicians, or when you also focus on the pinups. And in fact, you see that the increase is in part driven by the pinups because the speaking time of the pinups is not monitored. Okay. Just one thing before moving to the rest of the results, one question you might have is to say, yeah, but perhaps he just moved to the radical right because he thought that by doing so, he will attract more viewers. This is not what we find in the data. If anything, following the takeover, we have a drop in audience. You don't have an increase in audience. So this shift to the radical right is mostly driven by political considerations. Okay.
5 minutes, Julia.
Okay. So in the previous regression, I show you this like effect of the interaction between like takeover and time, just controlling for a channel fixed effect. What you can do with the data we have is that you can go even one step further and introduce not only channel fixed effect, but in fact controlling for host channel fixed effect. Okay, and so in this case, we are going to study the change in the coverage of different political groups within the continuing host channel pairs. And if we do so, what you find is that there is nearly full compliance. Okay, we find an increase by 1.6 to 3.1 percentage point in radical right timeshare, compared to a 2 to 5 percentage point increase documented before. So it really means that the change in editorial line is not like driven by the fact that you have like new host hired by the channel, but it's mostly driven by continuing hosts that change their coverage following the takeover. So then the question is, who are these continuing hosts and who are the leavers? Who are the movers? Who are the stayers? Okay. The first thing that I want to show is that following the takeover, you have a lot of journalists who left. It does not mean that they all wanted to leave. Okay, some of them might have left on purpose. Some of them might have just been fired. But what is really striking is that if you compare the propensity to stay on Bolloré channel versus other media outlets at the time, you see a drop in the probability of staying by 30 percentage points in the short run compared to a 50% baseline probability on control outlets. You really have this like increase in the propensity to leave the channel that is even stronger. But you see that if you consider all hosts. This is even more true if you consider the host with guests. And the drop is even like higher if we consider the journalist working as the host working as journalist. Okay, so really those that invite political guests. Okay, then we can look at the characteristics of those who leave, and this is what I just summarized in fact with this plot. We see that those that are more likely to leave are political guests, they are journalists, their show is a newscast, and it tends to be broadcast on prime time. Okay, where do they go? The first thing that you see, and it means that this takeover also have implication for the overall coverage of news in France, is that a large share of these hosts are not observed on other outlets a year later. And so we give a lot of evidence of that in the paper. So a lot of them, they just leave journalism. For those who do not leave journalism, it's interesting to see that they tend to be mostly observed on channels with lower speaking time for the right. So they leave to go on channels that are more to the left than the new bias introduced by Bolloré. Okay. So let me just conclude. We know that you have a lot of differences in coverage of politics across media outlets. Okay, we knew that before, we documented for France. What is of interest here is to try to understand the mechanism through which media outlets, they tend to bias the news. And basically here we show that they tend to do that through the choice of host who tends to adapt to the media outlets editorial guidelines. There is not a lot of composition effects, okay? And you have some positive sortings with some hosts more likely to work on channels that fit their predisposition. Okay. What is of interest is also that we have this case study that allows us to show the role played by host in this change in editorial line. And what we document is the fact that following Bolloré takeover, a lot of hosts who stayed just complying with the new guideline. A lot of hosts they also left, and those who left and continue doing journalism, it tends to work for channels that provide lower speaking time to the right. Okay. So yeah, I think I'm just on time. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much. That was very nice. So we can open it up for questions now. You can either raise your hand or you can ask questions directly. So just feel free. Okay. So maybe I'll ask the first question. So Julia, so what do you think are the policy implications of your findings? Like if I'm a policymaker, what should I do?
So there are like two main policy implications in my view. The first policy implication, I didn't spend a lot of time on that, but what we show with the data is that a lot of the slant come from pinups and not from politicians. We also document the fact that media outlets, they tend to invite more and more pinups and less politicians in terms of like speaking time share. And we think that this is due to the fact that when you invite pinups, you basically avoid speaking time regulation. So the first thing that we see is that in terms of policy implications, the regulatory agencies, such as ARCOM or Ofcom, they should take into account the speaking time of the pinups and not focus only on politicians. This is the first thing. The second thing, I didn't have a lot of time to stop on that, but if you look at our results on Bolloré, one of the things that we show here is that the hosts who stay are not the same than the hosts who leave. And in particular, we show that the host that tends to leave are also those that have more bargaining power. Okay? And so it means that basically all the journalists are not equal when there is a change in ownership. And perhaps what we should do is to introduce regulations that are going to increase the bargaining power of journalists when you have such a takeover. So you have like different proposals that have been discussed. For example, some people say, and I do agree with that, it would be good to give journalists, the newsroom, a veto on the choice of the editor-in-chief. This would be a way, for example, to reinforce the bargaining power of the journalist at the time of a takeover.
So there's a question from Alif. I'll read the question. The question is, the drop-off viewer after takeover may also be a poor result, not expected to be so, but rather a failure. So
that's true, but in this case, I think that what we should have expected. So just imagine that he wants to do that because he thinks that by moving to the radical right, he's going to increase the audience. And then you observe a drop in audience following the editorial line change. Then he should have moved back to the previous editorial line. And what we see is that on the contrary, he continue like one period after the other, increasing the speaking time share he devote to the radical right. So this would be like a repeated error. And in this case, it means that it's something on purpose.
other
I also have oh yes, I have a question. So from what I understand, like from your motivation, it would actually be best if to have a very diverse content within an outlet, right? So if you want a very diverse content within an outlet, wouldn't it be better to just have public channels where you just make sure that, let's say, every way people are leaning is represented in as diverse way as possible?
But like in our data set, we have both like public media outlets and private media outlets. And one of the things that we argue is that this kind of like regulations in terms of internet pluralism should apply both to public channel and to a private channel. I don't think that I think that it's good to have like a strong public broadcasters, but like public broadcasters are not like the only way first. And then we also know that you might have a lot of issues with public broadcasters, in particular when government tend to intervene. So in some countries, you have like more independence because you have a better governance. If you look at what is happening today in the news in Italy, for example, with Meloni, you see that public broadcasters is not the only solution. One of the things that
Berlusconi that was still behind it.
No, Berlusconi were not much better.
It's not that, but yeah. Yeah.
No, but one of the things that is of interest is the way basically owners acquire private media outlets. In a lot of countries, like in France, for example, but this is not the only case, when they want to broadcast on a given channel, this channel on terrestrial TV is given to them for free. And then it comes with a number of obligations. And so as part of these obligations, you have some regulation on pluralism, and I think we should go one step further.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Other questions?
I have a quick question. I was wondering if you've looked at any political outcomes after takeover by, I forgot his name, the French Robert Murdoch.
We would love to, but the main issue we have is that basically like the takeover took place at one point in time with basically a homogeneous penetration of these TV channels on the French territory. So we do not have any heterogeneity that we could exploit to analyze the consequences of the takeover in terms of like political participations and these kind of things. That's bad. And that's one of the limits of what we do. But basically, you know, like we also have all the literature. Now you have like a huge literature that showed, for example, that both like Sinclair in the US or Murdoch also, by biasing the news, they also affected the way people vote. And what we do here is that, in a sense, we tackle a different question. We try to understand how they are able to bias the news, even if they do not show up every morning in the newsroom.
Like, could you analyze how the voting patterns change as ownership changes and hosts change?
So we can look like overall in France, and for sure, if you look at the way people vote in France, like over the past 10 years, they vote more and more for the radical right. And I am going to argue in a sense that this is partly due to the shift of these television channels toward the radical right. But I cannot quantify it because I just have a simple diff, to say it like technically, and I don't have geographic heterogeneity that I can use to estimate it properly.
Very good. Okay, we can move on to the next paper. So thank you very much, Julia.
Thank you.
The next paper will be presented by Pooya Molavi from Northwestern University. And the title of the paper is Informational Autocrats, Diverse Societies. So over to you, Pooya.
Thank you so much. I hope you see my slides. Do you? Okay, perfect. And thanks for that great presentation, Julia. I think that was a very good kind of lead into my talk. So I'm going to spend less time motivating it. This is joint with Arda Gitmez, who's a political economist and theorist at Bilkent University in Turkey. Okay, so this is the theory paper, but let me give you a little bit of a motivation from the real world. So in the past 20 years, we've had a rise in a new type of autocrat that Guriev and Treisman call informational autocrats. Now, what makes these types of autocrats different from the 20th century autocrats is that they don't necessarily use the same kind of tactics like violence and force and coercion, and instead they keep a veneer of democracy. They keep some of the democratic institutions like popular elections, and they stay in power by trying to instead manipulate information. So there are many examples of the kind of tactics that these information autocrats use. They control state media, they censor independent media, they captured private media, and they bribe private media, among other tactics. So now, one thing that's kind of an obvious observation is that if you have an autocrat that can manipulate media, they can change the type of coverage that the media has, but they cannot force the citizens of a society to pay attention to the coverage. So information manipulation is a double-edged sword. There's a trade-off that the autocrat is facing. By biasing the coverage, you may be able to convince some citizens, but if the coverage is very obviously biased, maybe citizens stop paying attention to the coverage you're offering because you know exactly what the news media is going to say. You're not going to learn anything, new by listening to it. So there's this trade-off always. Now, we're going to think about the choice of paying attention to the coverage as a strategic choice by the citizens of society. So whether you pay attention to the coverage of a media is going to depend on two things, essentially. One is, as a citizen, your attitude about the autocrat. So if you're convinced that the autocrat is corrupt and you're very confident in your opinion, you may not want to pay attention to the media because no matter what they say, you strongly believe that the autocrat is corrupt and you're not going to follow them. Or if you're convinced that the autocrat is good, it's not corrupt, again, you may not want to pay attention to the news coverage because you have strong opinions, and regardless of what the news media says, you're gonna take the same action. But whether you decide to pay attention, it also depends on the bias of the coverage. So suppose you're not feeling strongly either way, you're somewhere in the middle, now you're gonna pay attention to the coverage that the news media is offering if it's informative enough that it might change the action you're taking. But then the bias of the coverage is going to depend on the distribution of attitudes. Why? Because the autocrat that controls the news media in our model is going to decide how to optimally distort the coverage. So in turn, everything is going to depend on distribution of attitudes in the society. So what do we do in the paper? We're going to have a model of an informational autocrat that is confronting a population of citizens who are sophisticated and heterogeneous. So what do I mean by sophisticated? I mean that the citizens' choice of whether to follow media is going to depend on the strategy that the media is following. So in particular, if the media is completely uninformative, citizens are not going to pay attention because regardless of what the news media says, they're not going to change their action, right? So that's what I mean by sophisticated citizens. Now, why is heterogeneity going to be important? Because it's going to make it difficult for the autocrat to align the message that it sends to different citizens to the citizens' attitudes. So in particular, if all the citizens in society have the same attitudes and opinions, it's very easy to manipulate them because you can send a message that exactly tailors to their opinions and attitudes. Whereas if you have diversity, it's going to be harder because you're sending the same message, and this message may be perceived differently by different citizens with different opinions. So the questions we're asking in the paper is, given the distribution of attitudes, first, how does information manipulation play out in equilibrium? We're going to have a kind of Bayesian persuasion game with a continuum of heterogeneous receivers. And so we're going to try to characterize how information manipulation happens in such an equilibrium. And more importantly, and this is the main focus of the paper, we're going to ask the question of which societies are more susceptible to information manipulation. And this kind of connects to a paper by Agorov and Sonin. They say and they show that there's a lot of variation in media freedom across autocracies. Even within autocracies, there's a lot of variation in media freedom. And we are wondering why or what can explain this variation. And we have one story in this paper. So what is the main takeaway of the talk in 1 minute, if you don't want to pay attention after this? So the main message is that when the societies become more diverse in their opinions, in the opinions of their citizens, it becomes harder to manipulate information for the autocrat, and as a result, you're going to have less information manipulation. So kind of tying into Julia's talk, this is saying that there's another benefit perhaps to pluralism because now pluralism is on the side of the society. If the society is more pluralistic with people having different opinions, information manipulation is going to be harder, and so society is going to be less susceptible to information manipulation. Okay, so I'm going to skip the literature since this is a very short talk and just jump right into the model. So it's a very simple model. This is the simplest model that can deliver this insight, and so we go with that. There's a state of the world that's binary. It's either 0 or 1. You can think about this state as being whether the autocrat is competent, or more generally, whether the interests of the citizens and the autocrat are aligned with one another. And then there's a prior that's a prior that the autocrat is competent, and we assume in this version of the paper that all the citizens and the autocrat share the same prior. In an earlier version of the paper, we also consider heterogeneous priors, and the main insights are kind of essentially the same. But for the purpose of this talk, you can think about everybody as having the same prior. Now, the interesting part is that instead of assuming that there is a kind of one citizen or one representative citizen, we're going to have a continuum of citizens. These citizens are indexed by R, which is a number that belongs to 0, 1. Each citizen takes an action, which you can think about as supporting the autocrat or taking the action that aligns with the interests of the autocrat. Now, each citizen has a cost of support or cost of taking this action, which is a number between 0 and 1. But the citizens are heterogeneous in their costs of support, and these costs are distributed according to some density F with CDF big F. So this is going to be the source of heterogeneity in the talk, but as I said, we can also accommodate other forms of heterogeneity, and the results I'm going to go through. So what are the payoffs? For citizens, the payoffs are very simple. They get a payoff that is normalized to 0 if they do not support the autocrat, and they get a payoff that depends on the state of the world and their cost of action if they do support the autocrat. So in particular, if the state is good, if the autocrat is good, and if you support it, you get a payoff of 1 net of your cost of support. If the autocrat is bad, then if you support the autocrat, you get a payoff of 0 net your cost of support CR. Okay, so that's the citizens. The autocrat, who's the sender in this game, just wants to maximize the support. Now this kind of simplifies the algebra, but you can generalize this, and the qualitative results will be the same. You can in particular assume that the autocrat wants to win an election, so you can put a voting model in. But for the talk, the autocrat is trying to maximize support. So what's the autocrat strategy? We assume commitment. If there are questions on that, I can talk about it. But so we assume that the autocrat can commit to messaging strategy. So what's the messaging strategy or communication strategy? It's a mapping from the state of the world to a distribution over a set of messages. You can think about this commitment power as some kind of editorial policy. So there is some set of rules that determine the kind of coverage you want to have, and then the actual journalists who deliver the coverage have some flexibility within the confines of that editorial policy. So what's the timing of the game? First, autocrat commits to the communication strategy sigma, then the state of the world is realized, messages are drawn according to sigma, and then each citizen observes a signal, or the same signal, essentially. Each citizen observes it, and they update their belief according using Bayes' rule, and then they decide whether to support the autocrat or not. Okay, so we can define a value function here as usual, as in Bayesian persuasion models. So what's the value function here? It's the payoff to the autocrat when the autocrat induces a particular posterior. So think about this V of mu function as the share of citizens that support the autocrat when the citizens have posterior mu that the autocrat is of the good type. So this is an increasing function, and in our simple model, it's going to coincide with the CDF of the distribution of costs. Why? The reason is that the a citizen is going to take an action R if and only if their posterior is above their cost of action CR. So, given the payoffs that we've specified and given the simple kind of observation, it's easy to see that the value function to the autocrat is just going to be the CDF. Now, that means that the derivative of the value function is going to be the density of types among citizens. Okay, so we consider two types of density in the talk. One is a density that corresponds to a monolithic society. This is when most people have types that are in the middle, and the types of different people are close to each other. Or you can have a divided society where there are types with extremely low or extremely high costs of support for the autocrat, and there are few people in the middle, and we separately analyze these two cases. So density, you can think about it also as the measure of citizens who are on the fence between supporting the autocrat and not supporting the autocrat when their posterior is exactly equal to me. Okay, so let's first talk about the monolithic society. The results are very similar in the divided society, and if there's time, I'll talk about those. So in a monolithic society, I want to show that when the society becomes more diverse, or when the opinions become more dispersed, then the optimal thing for the autocrat to do is to manipulate information less. To establish that result, I need to do two things. First, I have to first tell you what I mean by manipulate information less. So I have to first define a partial order or a full order on information manipulation. And also have to tell you what I mean by a more diverse society. So let's do that. But let me first tell you what I mean by a monolithic society formally. So society is monolithic if the density of types is single peaked, which is exactly what you expect. So there's some peak mu tilde. Before that, the density is increasing. After that, the density is decreasing. So this is going to be our notion of a monolithic society. Okay, so this is the value function in a monolithic society. Because the density is first increasing and then decreasing, the integral of the density, which is the value function, is going to be first convex and then concave. This just means that the optimal persuasion takes a very simple form. This is a simple result following this is a simple corollary of the main result in Kamenika and Genskow's seminal Bayesian persuasion paper. So what does the optimal persuasion strategy look like in this setting? Well, the autocrat is going to induce two posteriors. One of those posteriors is a posterior of 0. The other posterior is a posterior of mu hat, where mu hat is the point where this concave closure of function v, the value function, touches the value function itself for the first time, essentially, after point 0. So the optimal strategy is going to induce two posteriors. One of the posteriors is 0, and that means that in one of the under one of the signals that the autocrat is sending, the citizens are convinced that the autocrat is corrupt or bad. So the optimal strategy uses only two messages, and one of the messages fully reveals the bad state. So this means that we can easily define a measure of information manipulation in this setting. First of all, a strategy here is represented by two numbers because you only need to use two messages. So the first one is the probability of sending the good message when the state is bad. That's sigma 0. Second one is the probability of sending the good message when the state is good. Now, second part of the proposition I just showed you said that when the density is single peaked, one of the signals reveals the bad state. This just means that in the good state, you're always sending the good signal. And that implies that the optimal strategy can be summarized only by one number, sigma 0, which is the probability of sending the good message when the state is bad. Okay, so that means that we can define easily a notion of information manipulation. Think about two single peak densities, F1 and F2, and with the corresponding optimal strategies for the autocrat. The autocrat manipulates information less if he's sending the signal that the state is good less often when the state is bad, right? So this is exactly what you expect. So this autocrat always says the state is good when the state is good. Sometimes he says the state is good when the state is bad. Less information manipulation means that you're doing the latter less often. And this coincides in this very simple setup with the Blackwell order on informativeness. Okay, so this is our measure of information manipulation. Now I have to tell you what I mean by a society being more dispersed. Here we are introducing a new partial order. As far as we know, this is new, but it's very closely, it's very close, or it looks very close to the Autocrat notion of risk aversion. So let me tell you what it is. Think about two single peak densities, F1 and F2. We say that F2 is less dispersed than F1 if F2 can be written as a strictly increasing and convex function of F1. Okay, so let me show that to you in a figure. So these are a set of densities. As you go from the more red to the more gray one, you get less dispersion. So the types become more concentrated around the mode. So, this is a partial order. Not all distributions are ranked according to this partial order. However, some examples of families of parametric distributions are ranked according to the order. So, for example, if you think about beta distributions with the same mode, these are ranked according to this partial order. If you think about truncated normals with the same mean, they're also ranked according to the same order. Okay, so now I can tell you the main result for single peak densities. Think about F1 and F2 as representing two societies, and these societies are both monolithic, so they can be represented by two single peak densities. If F1 is more dispersed than F2, then the autocrat manipulates information less given F1 than F2. Okay, so what's the intuition for this result? The autocrat, remember, faces this trade-off. If the autocrat reduces sigma 0, this is less manipulation. It has a positive effect on the autocrat and a negative effect on the autocrat. So what's the negative effect? If you manipulate the information less, you're sending this good message. You're saying that I'm a good autocrat less frequently. So that's bad for you as an autocrat. You can think about that as the intensive margin. It's the intensity with which you're sending this good message. On the other hand, when you manipulate information less, more people pay attention to the messages. Because now the media is more informative, so it's more valuable to pay attention as a citizen. And you can think about this as the extensive margin. So the optimal persuasion strategy is balancing these two margins, balancing losing people and then having the people who pay attention support you as much as possible. Now, when you decrease the dispersion, you have fewer citizens that are on the fence. So think about the density that's spread out, and now you're kind of squeezing it to have most of the citizens in the middle. So there are very few citizens who are on the fence between supporting you and not supporting you. So it means that given a particular strategy, fewer people are paying attention to your messages. So you're losing on this extensive margin, which means that you want to kind of gain more people. You want to bring these two forces into balance, this extensive and intensive margin. You want to bring them into balance. And in order to do that, you need to make the media more informative. Now, this is kind of a rough intuition for the result. The proof is a little bit more subtle, but this should be good enough for a short talk. Okay, so this is a result in monolithic societies where the density of types is single peaked. We have a result that kind of mirrors this result in divided societies. So in divided societies, remember, you have many people with extreme types on both sides and very few people in the middle of the society. That means that the density of types is first decreasing, then increasing, which means that the value function is first concave and then convex. Now, again, we can say that the optimal persuasion strategy only uses two messages, but now the good message fully reveals this state. So what do I mean by that? This means that you always send the bad message when the state is bad, but sometimes you send the bad message also when the state is good. Okay. Now we can again define a notion of dispersion in the distribution of types. It's the exact same notion of dispersion. So distribution of types is less dispersed if it's a convex an increasing transformation of another distribution of type. So the exact same order, you can define it for single deep densities. And now you can also define, again, the notion of information manipulation. It's kind of the obvious thing. It's sending the good message when the state is good with a higher probability. So that means less information manipulation. So what's the result? Again, given these two orders, we can show that if the society is more dispersed, then the autocrat manipulates information less. So I can put these two results together into one single picture. So going from the right to the left, we get more and more dispersed society. On the far right, we have societies that are monolithic, with most people in the center and very few people with differing opinions. You have high manipulation in those societies. As the societies become more dispersed, the extent of manipulation goes down. On the left side, we have divided societies. These are societies with lots of people in the extremes, very few people in the center. Again, in divided societies, as you increase dispersion, you get less manipulation. Now, if you think about the transition from monolithic society to divided society, in that part, you can, it's not clear how you can compare manipulation, because the nature of communication strategy changes as you transition from one type of society to the other type. But everywhere else in this graph, as you increase dispersion, you're going to get less information manipulation. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but this is mostly what I had prepared. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about the conclusion. Okay, so what do I want you to take away from the talk? So, kind of our main result is that when the society is single-minded, it can be manipulated more easily. The flip side of that is that when a society is diverse, it is less susceptible to manipulation. And this is a kind of paper that's intentionally very simple. It's leaving out many forces. In particular, we leave out other media. So in our analysis, there's only a single media, and that media is controlled by the autocrat. But we think that these forces that we identify is going to be there in more complex models as well. So in particular, you can think about a model where there are other alternative medias. You can think about this as online or independent media. And if these online or independent media lead to more dispersed opinions, our result and our analysis suggests that then the society will become less susceptible to manipulation by autocrats. So to the extent that independent sources of journalism lead to more dispersed opinions, they could be good for protecting a society against information manipulation. And let me finish by showing you some suggestive patterns. Obviously, these are not any form of causal kind of claims. These are just suggestive, and this is from a Petrova 2008 paper. So this first figure shows a measure of media freedom. So this is a measure from Freedom House on the y-axis against the Gini coefficient, which is not our measure of this dispersion of opinions, but it is some measure of heterogeneity in a society. And it plots this for democracies. So in democracies, you see a downward sloping relationship between the two. As societies become more dispersed or more diverse according to Gini coefficients, the media freedom actually goes down. So this is not consistent with our story, but our story is about informational autocracies, countries like Russia or Hungary. Now let's look at the same figure in autocracies. So you see some suggestive evidence that as societies become more diverse, the media freedom increases in those societies. So let me finish with this kind of suggestive evidence and go back to the conclusion slide. I'm basically done. I guess I'm a little early.
Okay, perfect. That was excellent. Thank you very much. So we can open it up for questions. People can ask questions directly, or you can raise your hand and I can call you out. Okay.
I have a question about the dynamic. So you had the figure, I think, just before this. And it went a bit fast. So just from my understanding, like imagine you start out at a certain point, because of course the information manipulation also changes society. So can you detail how the dynamics would work at different points?
Okay, good. So we haven't really thought about dynamics. So if you have dynamics, if people are learning about the same state over and over, first of all, the commitment assumption isn't great, and second of all, I think under kind of general assumptions, you're going to have learning eventually. So people are going to learn the true state of the world. So what we have in mind here is more like maybe my calling this state, whether the autocrat is competent or not, wasn't perfect. Maybe. What we have in mind is more something where there's an issue that comes up, and on that issue, people have to render an opinion, and they can render an opinion that is either through voting or through participating in protests, and that opinion could be agreeing with what the autocrat wants them to do or not. So each interaction corresponds to a particular state, and so if that's the case, you don't have learning about the state.
Okay, sorry, then I didn't understand this. I thought this was also a figure about dynamics, but okay.
No. This is all about a snapshot. This is just kind of putting the comparative statics result on a figure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we are like, my intuition is that when you have a diverse society, then you cannot, as an autocrat, send a simple message because it won't appeal to all segments of society. So that's a constraint that limits manipulation. When you have only one kind of society, then you can easily communicate with a single message to manipulate them in the direction you want. So is that correct or incorrect?
Yeah, that's basically the high level intuition that when you have a single receiver, you can perfectly fine tune that your messaging to kind of get the most support possible from that citizen. But when you have different citizens with different beliefs or different causes, that's impossible to do because you're sending one message to all these different types, so you cannot perfectly fine-tune the message that you're sending, and so that makes it harder to manipulate them. You're absolutely right.
But is there a different kind of manipulation scheme that you haven't considered that would work better for diverse societies?
Good. So if you can privately target citizens, so if you know exactly citizens types, and then you can send a message to your supporters and send a different message to your opponents, you would be able to do as good in diverse society as you do in monolithic societies, I think.
So, because I'm thinking of India, where the government has basically bought the press. So there's like almost no free press any longer. And then the two big groups are like Muslim population and non-Muslim population. So very easy to identify. And the government basically wants to manipulate both groups. And so I was thinking what the optimal strategy for them would be.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder if they actually say potentially conflicting things to the two groups.
Yeah.
If if they're not reading each other's newspapers.
So it will be very because I know for one group it's a very clear message that the other group are the bad guys, but I don't know what they say to the other group that would appease them, So
yeah, I mean, I think that would be very interesting to look at.
There's a question from Alif. The dispersion would exclude pro-autocrat type. What happens if dispersion includes a pro-autocrat type versus not?
Okay, so good. So let me go back to one of these slides. So you can think about these guys here as being pro-autocrat, right? So we've done this normalization where everybody is paying a cost by supporting the autocrat, but these guys have very low cost of supporting the autocrat. Now, in an earlier version of this, we actually had people who had priors that the autocrat is good. You can really think about those citizens as being pro-autocrat. In that case, when we had heterogeneity of priors and costs, then we could show that in the end, these two dimensions of heterogeneity collapse into one-dimensional object, and all the results were with respect to that one-dimensional density. So kind of the high-level insights are the same if you instead of modeling it as cost heterogeneity, you assume that there's some people who are they believe the autocrat is good, so they're pro-autocrat in their opinions. Here, having a low cost is kind of a reduced form way of modeling being pro-autocrat, but the results are more or less the same.
Other questions? Very good. Looks like we're done. So thank you very much, Pooya and Julia. And we'll see.
Thank you.
We'll see the regular gang 1 month from now on June 11th. Take care and thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.